Abraham. And I guess the notable thing about Abraham, we've got a whole story about Abraham in the book of Genesis, but when you come to Isaiah 51, you have a rather interesting comment on Abraham. So this is Isaiah now writing more than 1,000 years after Abraham's death. And he says in Isaiah 51 verse 1, "Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness. Ye that seek Yahweh, look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. Look unto Abraham your father, and Sarah that bare you, for I called him alone, blessed him, and increased him." So what's the point? The point is, anybody that wants to understand righteousness has to understand Abraham. As our brother mentioned in his prayer, God imputed righteousness to Abraham. He called him a righteous man. Now that doesn't mean that Abraham never sinned, and that he only did acts of righteousness. In fact, what you find is that Abraham sinned in very much the same kind of ways as we sin. He did tell lies, for example. He did make decisions in which he didn't consult God. And he repeated the same sin more than once in his life. All the same kinds of things as we commit in our lives. So, when you look at biblical characters, faithful biblical characters, oftentimes you might read of a character, for example, the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle, before he came to the truth, he took people's lives. But when he came to the truth, you could think of him in Scripture as only really appearing to go from strength to strength forwards. And you might say, well, that's hard to relate to, because here's a man who's way up here as a spiritual giant, and perhaps somebody that it's pretty difficult to follow in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. Well, what about Abraham? Well, the difference you see with Abraham is he really is a person just like you and me. And he has the same problems as you and me. Not that the Apostle Paul didn't, but you read about them in Abraham's life. And so the point is that here's a man you really can relate to. He comes to the truth, he has reverses, he has triumphs, but all the while, even if it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, there is continual progress in Abraham's life. There's a proverb, which I'll show you later on. A righteous man, the book of Proverbs says, falleth 7 times and riseth up again. And that's the point. There are things that we do wrong. We make terrible messes of things in our lives at various times. The point is, what do you do next? And when dark clouds loom ahead and everything you've done seems to be a trail of destruction behind you, tomorrow's a new day. And what are you going to do tomorrow? Well, a righteous man gets up and starts all over again. And you see, that really is the great story of Abraham's life. And that's what's so encouraging about his life for us, and what makes it really worth studying in a very personal sense. Okay. This is how you could think of the life of Abraham. You could, as you're aware, Abraham, he begins in Genesis 11, but his personal story really begins in chapter 12 and concludes, the main part at least, in chapter 22 with the sacrifice of Isaac. And you can almost get Abraham's life and divide it between all the major characters that appear in his life. And so, for example, chapters 11 and 12, we've called Abraham and Terah. This is the introduction to Abraham, his departure from Ur of the Chaldees, and his establishment in the land of Israel. Terah, of course, was Abraham's father. So here's the introduction. Genesis 13, that's the story of Abraham and Lot. Genesis 13, Genesis 19, together somewhat, the story of Abraham and Lot. Genesis 14:15, the story of Abraham and Melchizedek. And chapter 15 is related to chapter 14. The 2 chapters sort of go together, even though Melchizedek doesn't appear in chapter 15. Abraham and Hagar, Genesis chapter 16. Abraham and Sarah, particularly Genesis 18 and Genesis 20. Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 22. You see, so Abraham's life really is punctuated by the great characters that he had interaction with through his life. And therefore you can split, as we're going to do this weekend, split his whole life into the characters with whom he had to do. And by doing that, you cover the entire record of Abraham's life. Ur of the Chaldees. So this is where Abraham grew up. And, it was an extremely civilized place. We might not think of it as civilized today, but for the times in which he lived, he grew up in one of the most civilized cities in the ancient world. It was built on the coast of the Persian Gulf, as it was then. Now, Ur of the Chaldees, now, as you'll see here, is actually some miles inland, well, 100 miles inland from the coast of the Persian Gulf. But at the time, they could take ships up to Ur of the Chaldees. What's happened, of course, was that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers have now silted up all this area here, and therefore pushed the coastline further eastward. But not in Abraham's day. So the point is that Ur was a major centre of trade. So he would have been privy to all the education that the world could bring into a trading city like that, all the goods that the world might bring into a city like that. As I say, it's tempting to regard some of these ancient cities with a certain level of disdain because they're not as informed as we are, they're not as modern as we are, and that perhaps therefore you think about someone in a patronising way about the inhabitants of these cities because they don't match our modern civilization. When Sir Leonard Woolley dug up Ur of the Chaldees in 1922, they found clay tablets there, cuneiform clay tablets. And those tablets contained everything from business transactions to primary school lessons. And they were able to identify those. So the point is, there was a sophisticated civilization alive and well in Ur of the Chaldees where Abraham grew up. And don't forget, it's called Ur of the Chaldees. Now, what do you know about the Chaldees? What do you know about the Chaldeans? Well, in Daniel chapter 1, the Chaldeans were the magicians of the day. They were the astronomers, the astrologers. They were the seat of wisdom. And this was Ur in the area of the Chaldees. So there's no shortage of, as it were, the wisdom of this world in that place, you see. And they worshipped idols in Ur of the Chaldees. In Joshua 24 and verse 2, it tells you that your fathers, Joshua says to them, to the children of Israel, your fathers worshipped other gods worshipped false gods on the other side of the flood. That is, on the other side of the Euphrates, your fathers worshipped false gods. So Abraham therefore grew up as an idolater in Ur of the Chaldees. And if you like, the local goddess of that area was a goddess called Nana, the goddess of the moon. So that's what they worshipped. And the ziggurats, therefore, as you see here, this is the ziggurat of Ur, the ziggurats they had there were devoted to the worship of the sun, moon and stars, and in Ur's case, particularly the moon itself. Well, Genesis chapter 11 and verse 26 first introduces you to Abraham. And it tells us in verse 26 of Genesis 11 that Terah, that's Abraham's father, lived 70 years and begat Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abraham, Nahor, Haran, and Haran begat Lot. So here's the family of Abraham, all descended from this forefather, this great forefather called Terah. And Terah's got three sons, as you've just read, Haran, Nahor, and Abraham. Now, just as you read verse 27, of course, it's tempting to believe that Abraham is the eldest in the family because he's mentioned first. But just with almost a cursory glance down the remainder of the verses of chapter 11 and verse 4 of chapter 12, you realise that just can't be the case. It tells you, for example, in chapter 11 and verse 32, that Terah lived 205 years. And when Terah died, therefore, verse 1 of chapter 12, Abraham leaves Haran, where they were, and at that time, Genesis 12 verse 4 says that Abraham is 75 years old. So Abraham's 75 years old when his father was 205 years old, when his father died. So Abraham was born, therefore, when Terah was 130 years old. But it tells you in verse 26 of Genesis 11 that Terah lived 70 years and begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So Terah's first son was born when Terah was 70 years old. Abraham, however, was not born until Terah was 130 years old. So Abraham, therefore, was not Terah's first son. I'd suggest most likely Haran was Terah's first son, because Haran dies in verse 28 of chapter 11 before his father Terah in the land of their nativity. So I would assume from that Haran was the eldest because he dies first. What we do know, however, as a concrete fact, is that Abraham definitely wasn't the eldest, but in fact was most likely the youngest, and therefore we would conclude that he's mentioned first in verse 27 of Genesis 11 because he was the most prominent of the three, not because he was the eldest of the three. Well, Terah means to turn and delay, and that's exactly what Terah did. His name means to turn and delay. So he leaves Ur. In fact, verse 31 of Genesis 11 tells you that he left Ur at the head of the company. He took Abraham from Ur and bound for the land of Canaan as they were, but they got as far as Haran. So here they are here. Here's the migration. So here's Ur, here's Haran, and here's the land of Israel, of course. And Terah takes his family. Now, Abraham was the one that was called. In fact, Isaiah 51 says God called him alone. So God actually only called Abraham. But Abraham's communicated that calling with the rest of his family, and it says in verse 31 of Genesis 11 that Terah took Abraham and those with him out of Ur, and they got at least as far as Haran. And the thing that happened then, of course, is that Terah sat down and did nothing further. His name means to turn and delay. So he never really made it. So here he is, leaving Ur bound for the kingdom of God, and he sits down halfway to the kingdom of God and stops there and dies there. Well, there's immediately a lesson there, isn't there? You could think of this, as you're learning the truth and you come to the truth. And there are people in ecclesial life, I know them, you'll know them. They start off in life with a hiss and a roar, and everything seems to be going extremely well. And all of a sudden there's some great event happens in their life. It might be that they get married, or it might be that they turn 30 years old, or 40 years old, or they have their first child, whatever it might be, and all of a sudden the Bible is closed, it's put on a shelf, or it appears to be so, and nothing more happens. Because they've got where they wanted to be, and they've reached a certain platform in life, and that's it. And they sit down and fall asleep halfway to the kingdom of God. It should never be, you see. Life's got to be a continual progression. Because the fact is, your nature, just like mine, if you're not making forward progress, you're making backward progress. Nothing ever stays the same. It's true in life, it's true in everything around you, and it's true of your human nature. If you're not putting something good in, then the bad will take over and send you backwards. Well, this, of course, is what happens in Terah's case. But Abraham has a brother. And that brother, was Nahor. Here he is here. Nahor means snorer. A bit of a play on the word Nahor, it appears, because if you say Nahor in a certain way, as you'll appreciate, it sounds like you're snoring. So that appears to be the meaning of Nahor's name. And that's what he was. He walked through life half asleep. I mean, he also only made it up as far as Haran. He never went further than Haran. So he was really a chip off the old block, just like his dad. His dad dies in Haran, so Terah dies in Haran. Nahor stays in Haran beside the grave of his father. He never ever makes it into the land of Israel. And years later, in Genesis 24 verse 10, Haran, the city of Haran, is called the city of Nahor. So Nahor was a prominent man, it appears, in the city of Haran. That's the only commendable thing you ever read in Nahor's life. He never does anything. He walks through life half asleep, he sits in Haran half asleep, or falls asleep in Haran, and never does another profitable thing. The only profitable thing you might say that ever happened in Haran's life was that he provided a wife for Isaac. And even she appears to be more the daughter of her mother than the daughter of her father. Because Haran, it appears, has a very industrious wife called Milcah, who brought up his children for him. And then there's Haran. Not the city, but the man, Haran himself. Haran means enlightened. And he might have been enlightened, but of course he never ever got out of Ur of the Chaldees. He died before the rest of the family left Ur of the Chaldees. So whatever enlightenment he might have had was obviously darkness, because he never made it out of the land of his nativity. But Haran had a son, and the son's name was Lot. Lot's sister was Milcah. She married her uncle Nahor. So the Milcah here and the Milcah here are the same. But Haran's son Lot, he does make progress, and he does go with Abraham. And they do leave Haran, the city of Haran, and they do make it down into the land of Canaan. Well, it tells you in verse 28 that Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took the wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iscah. So there we are, we've got them all listed for us. Lot, by the way, the man Lot, his name means veiled. So he wasn't asleep, but his vision was blurred. And here's a man, you see, who can't really see where things lead to. He can't see implications, so he's going to make decisions in his own life and in the lives of his children and in the life of his wife, which aren't wise decisions, because he can't see where things lead. He thought that he could go down and put his tent towards Sodom and not be affected by what was happening in Sodom. It appears as though Lot lost his ecclesia by his ill-judged decisions. So his name means veiled, and he was veiled. He couldn't see clearly where things would lead. Well, verse 30 goes on and tells you, in the context of all the family being listed here, but it says, Sarai was barren, she had no child. And that's important, because what does barrenness mean in verse 30? Well, it means you have no children. So why are we told that Sarai was barren, she had no child? We're told the same thing twice, you see. Well, the point is the record's emphasising it. This was the overwhelming trial of Abraham's life. He was married to a wife which couldn't have children. He's going to be the father of a multitude. Think about this, Abraham's camp, how big, Abraham's travelling. He's liquidated all his assets in Ur of the Chaldees. He's put them all on the ground. He's going to walk animals, at least from Haran down to the land of Israel. He's going to look for fodder for these animals. In Genesis chapter 14, when it comes to the battle of the kings, he's got 318 servants trained in his own house. If each of them, now those servants were adults, they were able to go to war. If each of them had a wife, you've got 636. If each of them has a child, you've got 1,000 people in Abraham's camp, and none of them are his. He's got children born in his house all over the place, in every second tent, and none of them are his children. Yet he's going to be promised that he's going to be the father of a multitude and a seed would come from him. And it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. Because his wife is barren. She has no child. So you can see this is going to be an enormous trial for a man like Abraham. Well, verse 31 says that Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. They went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran, and they dwelt there. There's no record, by the way, of Nahor actually going with them to Haran at this time. So there's the migration, as we said. There's no record that Nahor left Ur of the Chaldees with Terah and Abraham and Lot, but it appears clearly that he came at some subsequent time. It appears also, by the way, when you start to read history, that there was a fair degree of hostility between the two major ethnic groups that lived down here in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. And these are basically descendants of Ham and descendants of Shem. And there was hostility between them, and many of the descendants of Shem, it appears, moved up in a northward direction. So that it wasn't actually uncommon to see great caravans of people travelling up toward Haran, Semitic people, Shemites, because of the oppression of the Hamites. Remember that Nimrod was from Ham. And he has established this enormous kingdom down there, the Babylonian kingdom. And there was, it appears, historically hostility between these two great groups of ethnic peoples, disparate ethnic peoples. Well, then the call comes in chapter 12, verse 1. And it says, and you've got to make a change here, by the way, it says in chapter 12 of Genesis in verse 1 that Yahweh had said to Abram. And the word had is not actually there. Now God has already called Abraham to leave Ur of the Chaldees. But what he's going to do here in chapter 12 verse 1 is call him again to leave Haran. And when you read it carefully, what you find in Acts chapter 7 and verse 3, God, when Abraham was in Mesopotamia, God told him to leave his country and his kindred. In chapter 12, verse 1, when he's in Haran, God said, leave your father's house. This is a second call. So my point is, in Genesis 12, verse 1, not that Yahweh had said to Abraham, get out of my country, in reference to Acts 7, but this is a second call. God says to Abraham, get out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. Leave everything behind. Now, of course, Terah, Abraham's father, has just died in Haran. And Abraham's called now to leave Haran. So you can imagine his father's grave is there in Haran. Perhaps by this stage, Nahor's made it up to Haran. There'd be a fair amount of feeling that the family should stay together because Dad's just died. And the call comes to Abraham, don't be affected by it. He that loves mother, father, brother, sister more than me is not worthy of me. Get out of your father's house, you see. And despite the feeling there might have been, Abraham's now got to part with his family and take a very different course in life. So what becomes of Lot? Haran obviously was very much like his father Nahor was very much like his father Terah, and he wants to remain in Haran. Abraham's called to leave Haran, and Lot's now caught between them. His own father, Haran, has died, so he's going to have to decide which of his two uncles he aligns himself with. As you know, he leads with Abraham. He sees Abraham, it appears, as a better spiritual leader, so he's going to walk with Abraham out of Haran and leave the past behind. So that's the decision Lot makes. Well, it tells you in verse 4, as a consequence of Yahweh's call, that Abraham departed as Yahweh had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran, and he took Sarai his wife, Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. They went forth to go to the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. So what happens, of course, is that they now, here's Haran, the Euphrates River, you can't see it clearly on the map, but in fact it runs to the south of Haran. So they cross the Euphrates River in a typical baptism, and they walk toward the kingdom of God, as it were, as they now leave Haran and descend south into the promised land. How long were they in Haran? Well, we don't know. Perhaps 5 years, perhaps 10 years. Long enough, however, to become considerably wealthy. Because you see in verse 5 a reference to all their substance. So Abraham's an extremely wealthy man as he leaves Haran with Lot. Presumably he left Nahor in Haran also with a lot of substance. So the family's done pretty well, whatever they were doing in Haran. It's interesting, you know, that in Hebrews 11 and verse 9, it tells us that by faith Abraham sojourned in the land of promise, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob. That's what he did in the land of promise. And it appears as though Hebrews is making the contrast there, that before he got to the land of promise, he didn't dwell in tabernacles. Most likely he lived in a house in Ur of the Chaldees. Most likely he lived in a house, like the rest of the population would have done, in Haran. But everything changed, you see. He really made a break with the family and the ways of the family when he left Haran. Now, you perhaps have noticed that I jumped from verse 1 of Genesis 12 straight to verse 4 and omitted the promises of verses 2 and 3, simply because we want to talk about Abraham. I don't want to spend any time on the promises to Abraham, which are well known to you. But I'll just make a couple of comments on them because we're well aware of the significance of the promises to Abraham in a doctrinal context. We understand what they mean and how they relate to chapters of the New Testament, like, for example, Galatians chapter 3. What do you think those promises meant to Abraham himself? What do you think, for example, it meant back in 2000 BC when Abraham was told that he'd be a great nation? When God first told him that, what did it actually mean to him? Because, of course, he's just left one of the greatest nations in the world. And having left Mesopotamia, he's now told that he himself is going to become a great nation. Now, the only other great nation in the world at the time, of course, was Egypt. But Babylon's where the world began after the flood. And even before the flood, Babylon was the centre of civilization, because of course this is where the Garden of Eden was. So, that is clearly how Abraham would have understood the words great nation when God first told them to him. That he would have expected to become as significant in the world, as populous in the world, as influential in the world as ancient Babylon. Because that's what he's just left, that's what he's just going to come from. And God promised that that's what he would become. I will bless thee, God says to him. Well, you just read of all the souls and all the substance that Abraham's got. So clearly God has blessed him already. He's a very, very wealthy man, as he's left Ur of the Chaldees, even as he's left Haran. I'll make thy name great. Now that's interesting. Because this place down here was a place where names were great. Don't you remember in Genesis chapter 10, Nimrod, it says in Genesis 10 verse 9, Nimrod was a mighty hunter before Yahweh, wherefore it is said, even Nimrod, the mighty hunter before Yahweh. So it was a place which honoured men's names and ascribed all kinds of accolades to their names based on their prowess in this life. So he came from a place where men's names really were great, and the whole empire knew who Nimrod was. Well, you're going to become like that, Abraham. The world's going to know who you are. So just as Abraham heard these things for the first time, they would have meant something to him in his immediate context. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. All families on the earth began here, didn't they? Noah gets off the ark just up here. Noah's only been dead 100 years. This is this Fertile Crescent here. This is the cradle of civilization. Well, there's going to be a new earth and a new group of families, and they're going to come through Abraham. So he's going to create the spiritual family in very much the same way as Noah created the literal family. So this is the significance, you see, of these promises to Abraham. And on top of all that, Hebrews 11, a chapter that speaks about Abraham, but in Hebrews 11 and verse 10 it says, he left Ur, he dwelt in the land of promise, because he looks for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker was God. So he left Ur of the Chaldees here, and all the ziggurats and all the memorabilia that might have accompanied Ur of the Chaldees, all the significance of that place, because he looked for a city in the future. A city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. Now, you know what? How did Abraham get from Ur to Haran? Well, most probably would have gone through Babylon. The city of Babylon. Because the city of Babylon was a notorious city. It was on the banks of the Euphrates River. He's walking up. He's got to stay by a river as he walks up to Haran. You've got to appreciate, if Abraham wants to get to Canaan, why don't he just go straight across there? Well, it's a desert. How are you going to survive getting across here? It's hundreds of miles. So he's walking up the river and then down the coast to get to Canaan. And so I believe he would go through Babylon. Why wouldn't you go through Babylon? Well, do you know what he would have seen as he went through Babylon? He would have seen the great ziggurat of Babylon. And that ziggurat was called Etemenenkai. That was the ziggurat of Babylon. And the meaning of that name in English is the house of the foundations of heaven and earth. And here's a man that leaves that entire civilization looking for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker was God. Remarkable, you know. So even the promises that he was given would have had an immediate meaning, an immediate significance, you see, in his own life, as he now goes down to the land of Canaan. Well, here he is now, coming into Canaan. Verse 6. He dwelt in the land of promise, because he looks for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker was God. So he left Ur of the Chaldees here, and all the ziggurats and all the memorabilia that might have accompanied Ur of the Chaldees, all the significance of that place, because he looked for a city in the future. A city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. Now, you know what? How did Abraham get from Ur to Haran? Well, most probably would have gone through Babylon. The city of Babylon. Because the city of Babylon was a notorious city. It was on the banks of the Euphrates River. He's walking up he's got to stay by a river as he walks up to Haran. You've got to appreciate, if Abraham wants to get to Canaan, why don't he just go straight across there? Well, it's a desert. How are you going to survive getting across here? It's hundreds of miles. So he's walking up the river and then down the coast to get to Canaan. And so I believe he would go through Babylon. Why wouldn't you go through Babylon? Well, do you know what he would have seen as he went through Babylon? He would have seen the great ziggurat of Babylon. And that ziggurat was called Etemenenkai. That was the ziggurat of Babylon. And the meaning of that name in English is the house of the foundations of heaven and earth. And here's a man that leaves that entire civilization looking for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker was God. Remarkable, you know. So even the promises that he was given that would have had an immediate meaning, an immediate significance, you see, in his own life, as he now goes down to the land of Canaan. Well, here he is now, coming into Canaan. Verse 6. End of verse 5 tells you, into the land of Canaan they came. Verse 6 of Genesis chapter 12. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. So here's Abraham now, making his way down from north to south through the land. And Sichem is Shechem, or very close to Shechem, between the shoulders of the two mountains. And so here's Abraham's first major landmark, if you like, as he comes into the land of Canaan. Shechem means the burden bearer, from a root between the shoulders, because of course it was a city in the saddle between Ebal and Gerizim. And Abraham stops there, it says, and you can make this change in your text. He comes to the plain of Moreh, it says in verse 6. Now the word plain ought to be the word oak, as the tree. As the RSV says, as Robin says, he actually comes to the oak of Moreh. He comes to this copse of trees, it appears, in which there was a specific tree that he stops beside. That's a very notable, a very large oak tree. And it tells you in verse 7 that Yahweh appears to Abraham when he's there, and God said, unto thy seed will I give this land. And so there Abraham builds an altar to Yahweh who appeared to him. So it appears, an angel appears to Abraham when he's by this tree, makes a further promise to him, a promise, I might add, of a seed, which his wife couldn't have. And Abraham builds an altar there at that place to commemorate the event. Well, there was a problem with that promise. And the promise was that he didn't know how that was going to happen, because his wife can't have children. But that's not the only problem with the promise. You see, two things are promised in this verse, and both of them have got the same problem. Unto thy seed, a problem, will I give this land, a problem. Because there's a problem with the land. There's a famine in the land. It says so in verse 10. In fact, it tells you that twice in verse 10. He's got a barren wife. He's got a barren land. And he's promised a child, which his wife can't have, and a land which grows nothing. And so, you look at the promise like you're seeing in verse 7 here of Genesis chapter 12, and you think, well, what's Abraham going to make of that? It doesn't really seem like much of a promise at all. Because he can't have children, and the land is just dirt and dust. What does Abraham do? He's not happy. He's got a large amount of animals with him. He's got a large number of people with him. He's got to feed them. It's not so easy to do. Verse 8, he removes from thence to a mountain on the east of Bethel. He goes south. So here we are. Verse 7, we're in Shechem. Verse 8, we're now down at Bethel. He's got to keep moving. He's looking for somewhere to set up camp. But there's nowhere obvious that he can do that, because there's nothing to eat for miles and miles around. Verse 9, Verse 8, he builds an altar there as well between Bethel and Ai. Ai, in the authorised version, is Ai, the city of Ai, which Joshua conquered. Verse 9, it tells you that there's nothing there, so Abraham journeys going on still toward the south. So he can't see anything there. The problem is, verse 10, there's a famine in the land. So he goes down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous. And as I say, twice it mentions the famine in the land. Now that's interesting, because I mentioned to you in verse 7 that he was given a promise. And the promise was twofold. It was a promise of a seed, and it was the promise of the land. As we said, that was a difficulty for Abraham because his wife couldn't have children, and as it were, nor could the land. The land couldn't give birth either. Twice you're told in verse 10 that the land was barren. Twice you're told back in chapter 11 and verse 30 that his wife was barren. That's interesting, isn't it? So here's a promise which seems somewhat to be a bit of an empty promise. Not that Abraham wouldn't have believed that God could do what he said, but how would God do that? And look at the prospects. And Abraham's now looking for a place to set up a tent, and there's no obvious place that he can do that. So down he goes, down he goes, down he goes to Egypt. Now what's Egypt? Well, you see, Abraham's just come from Ur of the Chaldees. You didn't really have famines in Ur of the Chaldees because the city was on the banks of a major river. Well, Egypt, of course, is equally on the banks of a major river. So Abraham would understand that Egypt was going to be a place very much like what he left in Ur of the Chaldees. And if we have a problem with a famine in the land and everything that means, well, you're far better off to survive something like that in Egypt than you ever would be in the land of Canaan. And so down to Egypt he goes. And that's interesting, you know, because he makes an altar in verse 7 when he's at Shechem, here. He makes an altar between Bethel and Ai when he's there. The next thing you read is he's down here in Egypt. No more altars. Doesn't ask God's advice, I'm going to Egypt. He makes a decision. In fact, he makes a snap decision. I mean, Abraham is a man that does make decisions. And so he takes it upon himself, he makes this decision, and it appears he doesn't consult with God before he makes this decision. But you can see Abraham's in a bit of a predicament. He's got hundreds of people now depending upon him to find food, depending on him to take a reasonable direction in ecclesial life. There's nothing to eat anywhere. You've got children crying. You've got the men of Abraham's coming to him saying, well, Abraham, what are we going to do? How's this exactly going to work? Now, show me how you're going to provide for all of us. So there'll be people leaning on Abraham now, and there'll be a fair bit of discussion in the tents at night about what sort of a leader Abraham was. And you can see the pressure mounting like this. And Abraham's in a bit of a tough spot. He's got public opinion, as you can imagine, starting to move against him, and he's got to solve a problem in his ecclesia. Well, the problem is he looks to the world for solutions and he doesn't look to his God. And do you think God knew that his wife couldn't have children? Do you think God knew that the land was barren? But both of those things are combined in the same promise in chapter 12, verse 7. And Abraham thinks he's got to take it upon himself to find a solution. Now, I'm critical of Abraham on this, but let's be frank. What if you sold all your assets and bought a whole lot of cows and therefore invested all your money in this livestock, and you start on a great trek into the interior of this continent, and there's nothing on the ground to eat, and you're watching your assets drop on the ground dead every other mile, and you've got a large ecclesia with you that you've got to provide for, what would you do? What would I do? Would you look to the world for solutions, particularly if there was a big sign saying, go to Egypt, there's water down there? Of course you would. It's a very natural thing to do. It wasn't the right thing to do, but it was a natural thing to do. Why wasn't it the right thing to do? We've got these little things in Scripture. See, look at this in verse 9. Verse 10. It tells you in verse 10 there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt. Look at chapter 13, verse 1. Abraham went up out of Egypt. Now, I don't believe the reference to going down in verse 10 of chapter 12 and coming up in verse 1 of chapter 13 is a reference to north and south. This is a spiritual decline Abraham takes in chapter 12, and a spiritual ascent he takes in chapter 13 when he leaves Egypt. That's the significance you see. Well, he's got a problem. He's got to solve a problem. The problem was no water. Here's a quote for your margin. So perhaps put this in your margin beside chapter 12, verse 10. Isaiah 30, verse 2. Woe to the rebellious children that walk to go down into Egypt, and have not asked at my mouth, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Abraham does not make it a matter of prayer before he goes into Egypt. It appears he simply makes his own decision because he can't see any way out of the predicament. He's making altars as he goes progressively south down the land. He makes no altar before he makes the decision to go to Egypt. Can I say that Abraham wasn't praying at this time? Well, I don't have to say that, but what I can say is he's not consulting God about the major decisions in his life or in the life of his ecclesia. And he makes a decision to take a worldly solution here, and it's going to result in all kinds of trouble. He didn't run out of water, but he just about ran out of everything else. In fact, he just about ran out of life. He was lucky to escape with his life as he leaves Egypt because of the problem he's now going to create for his family in Pharaoh's house. And here it is, verse 11, chapter 12. Came to pass when he was come near to Egypt, that he said unto Sarah his wife, listen, behold now, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass when the Egyptians shall see thee, they shall say, this is his wife, and they'll kill me. But well, they will save thee alive. And he's just been told he's going to have children. If the Egyptians kill him, he can't have children. So it would have been obvious immediately from God's revelation to him that he couldn't die, at least not before he had a child. That doesn't seem to occur to Abraham. Say, I pray thee, verse 13, that thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, for my soul shall live because of thee. Forget about what problems that causes you, dear. It'll save my skin if we tell this little expedient. And of course that's what they did. You know, the interesting thing was when you go to chapter 20, you find out that Abraham and Sarah had agreed to tell this lie even before they left Haran. It's not as if Abraham all of a sudden in verse 11 realises that Sarah's attractive to look upon, that they're going into another major society, that he could be endangered because he's her husband. They worked that out way back in Haran. Haran was also a major society. And they've agreed, if they ever got in a tight spot, that this is what they would do. So Abraham pulls out his card and plays this card and says, well, you know, this is what we agreed. Let's do what we agreed to do. Well, as a consequence of this, he's going to demonstrate a lack of faith. He's going to compromise his wife. She's going to end up in the house of another man, as you know. He's going to deceive the princes of Egypt. The result of that, he's going to bring the whole house of Egypt into trouble, and then he's going to get caught. He's going to get humiliated. He's going to get deported from the country. In fact, it appears the Egyptian customs officials escort him to the border and say, go away, don't come back. And when he gets back to Israel, when he finally, in chapter 13, gets back to the land of Canaan, what does he find? Well, this is what he finds. Chapter 13, verse 7. There was strife between the herdmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. What's the significance of that? Well, you might like to just colour in the phrase at the end of verse 7, the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. Because a very similar phrase appears back in chapter 12, verse 6, at the end of that verse. The Canaanite was then in the land. How come the Canaanite didn't feel he had to go down to Egypt? How come there was no water or no fodder for Abraham in the land of Israel, but the Canaanite managed to get along okay in the land of Israel? And what's more, the Canaanite multiplies. He becomes the Canaanite and the Perizzite. It's interesting, the children of this world are in their generation often wiser than the children of light. The Canaanite could see a way through this famine that Abraham couldn't see. But Abraham's the father of the faithful. He's got God walking right beside him and he cannot see a solution. But even the Canaanite, who's praying to a very different God, said, no, we'll tough it out and we'll get by. Amazing. Quite a rebuke, actually, between chapter 12 and chapter 13. By the Canaanite of all people. The Canaanite of all people to Abraham. Well, Abraham's 75 years old, it told you in chapter 12 and verse 4. Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham. So she's 65 years old. I mean, how beautiful can she be at 65?
Clean that up.
Shouldn't have said that, should I?
Tell him, Wendy.
But these are days when the patriarchs live twice as long as we do. So you perhaps could imagine, if we're living 70 or 80 years old today, that Sarah must have looked something like 35, 40 years old. And she's going to turn the heads of the Egyptians. That's Abraham's fear, and of course that's exactly what happens in the land of Egypt. Well, verse 16, as we say, the inevitable happens. Verse 16 of chapter 12. Pharaoh, verse 15, the princes of Pharaoh come and take Sarah. And in verse 16, what's more, Pharaoh entreats Abraham well for her sake. And he had sheep and oxen, he asses, maidservants, she-asses, and camels. So not only does Pharaoh take Sarah into his house, but he pays Abraham for her. So this is really the price of his wife. Now, how would you receive that money? How would that be? And what do you think the look was that went between Abraham and Sarah as she departs to go into another man's house? Do you think it might have occurred to them that this little expedient that they told wasn't really so smart after all? And by the way, I mentioned a moment ago that Abraham told a lie regarding Sarah, his wife. Was it a lie or wasn't it a lie? I mean, what did Abraham say? He says, she's my sister. Was she his sister or wasn't she his sister? Yes, she was. She is his half-sister. The daughter of his father, but not the daughter of his mother. So Terah clearly had more than one wife. And Sarah was the daughter of a different wife to Abraham's mother. But here's the point. And think about this carefully. The minute you tell a truth as though it's the truth, you tell a lie. Abraham's intention clearly is to deceive. The intention was clearly to imply that she wasn't his wife. What can you mean if I'm married to somebody and I say she's my sister? The immediate implication is that she's not my wife because you don't marry your sister. So Abraham tells a technical truth to imply a lie. Politicians do this all the time. They tell a truth. They avoid other material information that would completely change your view of the situation. And after all the cards have been dealt and the dust is settled and the problems come out or been exposed, they will walk away and say, I never told a lie. They did tell a lie because they omitted clear and important details which would have changed your perception. Simply to tell a technical truth and to avoid other material information is not good enough. To tell a truth as though it's the truth is to tell a lie. Why am I emphasising it? I'm emphasising because you've got to appreciate that point, because the minute you believe that you can tell a half-truth in ecclesial life and walk away and think yourself blameless for that, I could never trust you in ecclesial life. Who could ever trust you in ecclesial life? You're going to misrepresent situations. So never ever make a mistake. This was a lie, and it was clearly intended to deceive. And why has Abraham done it? To save his own skin. Because he was afraid of getting killed so that people could take his wife off him. That's all there was to it. So it was a lack of faith, a lack of trust in God, and clearly, verse 7 of Genesis 12, a lack of appreciation about what these promises would mean. Well, one thing leads to another. He's in Egypt. And here's a few proverbs for you as far as the situation is concerned. Proverbs 29 verse 25. The fear of man bringeth a snare, but whoso putteth his trust in Yahweh shall be safe. Proverbs 24 verse 16. A just man falleth 7 times and riseth up again, but the wicked shall fall into mischief. Abraham is going to recover from this. And he's going to start all over again and learn enormous lessons. Lamentations 3 verse 22. It is of Yahweh's mercies that we're not consumed, because his compassions fail not, they are new every morning. And you think about that. You combine those last 2 quotations we've got there. There's an enormous exhortation here. Firstly, a just man falls 7 times and rises up again. We make mistakes, we make terrible mistakes, we repeat our mistakes. The issue is get up and start again. Because Lamentations 3 says, new every morning are God's mercies. So close the day in prayer, consign the whole day to history, extract whatever meaningful lessons there are, close your eyes, go to sleep, get up again early in the morning with a clean piece of paper and start all over again. And if you do that, God will too. New every morning are his mercies. So it really doesn't matter what you've done. There's no unforgivable sin in that sense. Start the new day with a clean piece of paper, but get up again and make positive progress forward. Well, what happens? God plagues, verse 17, God plagues Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. It doesn't say because of Abraham, it says because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Sarah was probably engaged enormously in prayer at this time, in a way that Abraham wasn't. And it's Sarah that's going to be the saviour of the situation, really, because God acts for her. Pharaoh realises there's something wrong in verse 18. He calls to Abraham, and look at the question. How would you answer these questions? What have you done? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? You see, Pharaoh thinks he's been lied to. Well, he was lied to. Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken to her to be my wife. Well, he clearly intended to do that. Now, therefore, take your wife and go your way, he says. Abraham doesn't say a word. Then what can he say? What are you going to answer those? What are you going to tell the truth and say, yep, I didn't think there was any truth in this place. I thought you'd kill me. That's why I did it. And that is the answer. Pharaoh commanded his men, verse 20, concerning Abraham. They sent him away and his wife and all that he had. Get rid of him. He's lucky to escape with his life. Understand who Pharaoh is. Your life and mine have been nothing like small dust under his chariot wheels. I mean, we're nothing to him. Abraham, it was for Sarah's sake that Abraham doesn't lose his life on this occasion. So what does Abraham do? A just man falls 7 times and gets up again. Look what he does. He went up out of Egypt, right. Retraces his steps directly. He went down before, verse 10. He's going up this time. He, his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south, it says. Verse 4, where does he go? Unto the place of the altar which he made at the first. And there Abraham called on the name of Yahweh. He goes back to that altar between Bethel and Ai that you read about in verse 8. So the last time he really had a relationship with God where he involved God in all his decisions, he goes right back to that place. And you can imagine Abraham looking at this heap of stones on the ground that he'd put there between Bethel and Ai before any of this happened. Going back there, as you and I do often in life, and you go back to a place where things were perhaps in a better situation for you, and you remember the time when the situation was good, and you think, oh, don't know, I wish I could wind the clock back to when I was here last time. But he's retraced his steps, you see. And he's gone right back to where he was before, and now he wants to put everything right. He will never, ever go to Egypt again in his life. He won't even let his son, when his son comes to take a wife, he won't even let his son leave the land of Israel. Did he learn lessons from this? Absolutely. He will never repeat that sin. He's going to repeat the sin as far as his wife's concerned, that little expedient, as I say. But he'll never ever leave the land of Israel again. Retraces his steps, goes right back to where he was at the start, and is now going to begin all over again. Here's the summary. As the record of Abraham's life opens, we see at once a man who's powerfully motivated by the things of God, and yet who was uncertain and timid in the face of the trials of life. It's true, isn't it? He was emboldened to leave the security of his family, but didn't feel as though he could see a way through other problems, even when the world managed to. That's true too. Then, having begun a downward slide, he multiplied sin, making a decision which compromised his wife, imperiled the promise of the seed, endangered his own life, and brought the truth into disrepute. What do you think Pharaoh thought of Christadelphians after this? But even if he wasn't courageous, Abraham was a man of deep personal honesty. And having failed, he got back up, he began again, retracing his steps, making his peace with God, and doubtless with his wife.